Hello and welcome to this session called Strategies Part 3, where we delve even deeper into the structure and sequence of people's thinking. As always, as we're on an online class, I would highly enjoy and welcome your interaction. I find it one of the most valuable parts of doing these sessions, and there's several ways that we can interact. If you have a headset with a mic, and you would like to talk, just raise a hand and you'll see a button there to raise a hand, and I'll unmute you and we can hear your lovely voice. If on the other hand you would prefer to type, then just type in the little box there and we can all interact that way as well. So several ways of interacting. I will ask with the typing, can we keep it all on track to the subject of tonight? Because it is very tempting. You see somebody great online, there's James there, and you think, I need to ask James a question, and it may be a private question. Well, if you ask a private question, everybody can hear, can read the question. So let's keep everything on track. So we've been exploring strategies. We talked about several things so far. We talked about the importance of being very clear about our goal. And I want to expand a little bit on that tonight also. We've talked about the notation. Now, it's very tempting when we explore notation to think that's the strategy. It's really not. It's a shorthand. And I've stressed this in the past, and I'm stressing it again now, because the shorthand helps us collect this vast amount of information that we're collecting very quickly. So I also want to demonstrate how easy it is to pick up lots of information and how useful the shorthand can be, because there is so much coming at us. So several things I wanted to talk about tonight. A, relating to having a goal. What is the goal about? Then I'd like to have a look at an example of a strategy. This is taken from Robert Dilts's Strategies for Genius Volume 1, and it's a letter that Mozart wrote about coming up with new ideas. So we're going to look at a section there. And as the last couple of sessions, I haven't left a lot of time for questions. This time I do promise I will leave plenty of time for questions. So that's my aim. Alright, so coming back to our goal. So to keep in mind, and one of the things that I haven't expressed yet, is the different types of strategies. We have micro, macro, and meta strategies. Now, micro strategies is essentially what we've been focusing on so far. Being very detailed, looking at a particular moment of somebody doing this ability. So, for example, if we were modeling somebody and their buying strategies, and we wanted to know how do they pick the right shirt, piece of clothes. Well, at this point, what we're really going to narrow into the very last time they had a successful time when they bought something they were very pleased about. And I have them think about that. Tell me more about that. Tell me about the shop that you went into. So what did you do next? What did you do next? Very detailed, and we want it to be ideally in the kitchen doing. If not, think of a particular time that it went exceptionally well. The danger for us with that is to go, okay then, so when you shop, what do you do? Now notice that tends to create a generalization in somebody's mind. And what they start to then do is tell you what they think they do. So I am stressing once again, when we're doing this, we're going to go, okay, when was the last time you actually did this? Tell me about that. And pinpointing down to a small chunk of information, a particular time, rather than a generalization. And what that tends to do is elicit a micro strategy. Now, what is a macro strategy? So this is a much higher level program. So this is when somebody's modeling something like success and leadership. Notice success and leaderships are nominalizations as words. They mean different things to different people. So when we're after a macro strategy, we're normally talking step A leads to step B leads to step C. Now, how do you get there? Well, as long as when you're starting here, you need to accomplish this. Then you need to be able to accomplish this, i.e. step A, B to C. How you get there is just part of what you're doing. And each macro strategy will contain lots of micro strategies. So if I'm going to go from point A to point B to point C, what we haven't said is how do we think from point A to point B? So what is it that I need to actually do? And that becomes much more of a micro strategy. So a macro strategy would be things like time management. Okay, you sit down, you need to write a list out of all the things that you do for that day. Step 1. Step 2, prioritize that list. Step 3, do the first thing on that list. But notice, in between, we haven't talked about what's the thinking process, what is the detail of doing that. So that would be a macro strategy. A meta strategy is basically we're looking for models that will create a model. So if you think about it, strategies is a way to create models. So strategies themselves would tend to be a meta strategy. And the meta model is a language strategy, a model for creating models, which the Milton model came out of, and presupposition started to come out of the meta model. So anything that creates other models we're calling a meta strategy. So how we approach strategies from this standpoint of our goal does make a difference. If we want to know something like success or leadership, we're really doing macro strategies. And then within there, we might want to know certain micro strategies. So this all comes back to being very clear about our goal. What is it that we're after? And as I haven't mentioned the different levels before, I thought it was worth mentioning at this point. So before we move on to the next section, are there any questions in particular about micro, macro and meta strategies? Okay, excellent. So let's move on to the next section. Here, what I was interested in doing is looking at some language and starting to pick out the strategies from it. So I'm going to take an example from Mozart. It's a letter, as you see, written in 1789, where he was talking about how does he compose. So this is the smallest chunk. This is basically how he gets going. And we're going to have a look at this and then start to break apart the information that we can glean from this. I also note that Martin's typing, so he's probably typing a question about what we've just done. So as Martin's doing that, rather than read this to you, I invite you now just to read this to yourself. I'll give you a moment to do that, and that allows Martin to finish typing what he's typing, and I'll answer that question before we move on. And if anybody's good at humming Mozart, please do for background music. Right. So Martin said, can we distill a series of micro strategies from the macro strategies in and around the same time that we're looking at modeling the project? And that's a lot of what you'll be doing on the Master Practitioner when we're doing the modeling project. Is a lot of the models that have been proposed to me are macro strategies that people are after. Now within that would be the micro. So yep, that's a good insight, Martin, that when you're doing the macro ones, there'll be certain details of the strategies that you'll be after, and they'll be the micro ones. So good work. Like your thinking. Right, so we've all had a chance to have a go at reading this, and I see now Jeremy's asking some questions. I knew there would be some questions tonight, which is just fabulous. So we're going to start to break this apart and find out what information we can glean from this. So as Jeremy's pointed out, that's essentially a story within a story. That's right, that's a nice way of thinking about it. Right, so let's have a little look at some of the things that we can glean from Mozart's letter. So we know that there's some psychological conditions that he's telling us straight away that have to be in place for his strategy to work. So he needs to be congruent. When I am, as it were, completely myself, so that's congruent, he's aligned with himself. He's also talking about there seems to be a relationship with this outer and inner world that's undisturbed. So I'm entirely alone and of good cheer. So he's in good mood, and he's alone. There's no one else around him, and he has this positive feeling. So there's some psychological conditions within that short paragraph that he's illustrated to us that makes the what's the right word? Composing, starting to come up with new ideas, work. It's also, if we note here, it's not just that he's feeling good, that he's undisturbed, and he's in alignment. There also seems to be something else going. He says, travelling in a carriage or walking after a meal. So, once he's got the psychological conditions, there needs to be some sort of movement or motion for this strategy to work. Just from that short little paragraph, we've picked up a lot of information about what's behind this strategy, what are the emotions and the physical condition, as we put down here, that are the precursor for this strategy working. Alright, so let's delve deeper into this idea. And it's on such occasions my ideas flow best and most abundantly. Now, one of the things he's implying here, because he hasn't said anything about the mind, is that he allows the thoughts to take shape themselves. So they emerge from the unconscious mind. It's almost that he has to get out of his own way to allow the conscious mind to drift off and go into this trance where he's by himself, he's congruent, there's some sort of movement. And notice, the movement that he talked about was either walking or in a carriage. Now, they both set up a rhythm, especially a carriage. A carriage has set up this rhythm. And if you've ever been on the train, it goes... As you listen to that, you'll often find your mind drifting. And that can be the same with walking. Next, he's indicating to us, those pleasures that please me, I retain in my memory. So, what he's looking for is a positive feedback loop. And that seems to be connected with his memory. Now, a couple of things for this to work, we have to assume that you have a good memory around sounds. Mozart did. Next he says, accustomed, as I have been told, to hum them to myself. So he's got this reinforcement, so he's got this pleasure, kinesthetic, with this auditory, so outward, as he says, and he can hear himself, to hum to himself. That creates a form of a synesthesia. Quick note on synesthesias, just to remind ourselves, synesthesias are overlapping of the senses. And good musicians tend to have an overlap of auditory and kinesthetic by about 40%. This is why you do get musicians saying that feels good rather than that sounds good. So he's setting up this feedback loop. Right, so It's given us all the clues that we need for this very small first part of the strategy. So here it is. A kinesthetic feeling combined with physical movement. So where did we get that from? Okay, so we've got this. Remember the letter, when I am, as it were, completely myself, congruent, entirely alone and of good cheer, kinesthetic. Travelling in a carriage or walking after a good meal. Now, not just any meal, it has to be a good meal, and rightly so. With physical movement. Okay, so we've got pleasurable kinesthetic feeling. So that internal feeling starts to arise and produce sounds or tones. So it comes on from the inside and emerges out of this positive kinesthetic feeling. That feeling turns into some sort of sound. Then we've got internal auditory, which is a feedback loop, and that builds on itself until it causes an auditory external, which is him humming to himself. So he's got this kinesthetic external movement, carriage, humming, which he's listening to the outside. So as he hums, he's listening to himself. Now that only kicks in once the positive K and a positive I builds. That's literally the first few moments of a listening strategy from Mozart. And yet we've got so much information. So much so that we could start to produce a map to help somebody do this. Now, what I like about this, and this is one of the things you'll start to find when you elicit strategies and you get used to the process, is you go, you know what, I could use that for something else. You could use that for writing. You could use that for getting projects done. In here is the first stages of Mozart's strategies. Right, so in that small section, and let me put the letter back up for you guys to have another read of it. This is the smallest section. It's a paragraph or so. We picked up huge amounts of information. So I now invite questions and observations. As I promised, I wanted to leave plenty of time this evening for questions and observations. And great, we've already got Karen typing, and I'm sure a few of others are now just formulating your questions, and you'll start there. Right, Karen, saying, I'm losing sound. We'll disappear and revisit. Thanks. Okay, I'm sure she's not saying thanks to that. Now, the challenge with these online classes is that people all around the country have different levels of input of internet connections. So here I have an ongoing process where it gives me a visual feedback on the internet connection leaving from here. So our bandwidth, which is lovely, is excellent at the moment. So I do apologise, Karen. It could be many things. It could be just in your area, just a few extra people on the internet tonight. Now Charlotte's typing, and we'll find out whether she's got the same situation or has got a question. So just waiting for those to come through. Alright, so Charlotte's saying, and that same thing happens for her. There's lots of thinking and ideas. Yes, this pattern comes up many times. You'll find Edison talking about the same type of thing. You find Picasso talking about, Leonardo da Vinci, Einstein, talking about, they seem to, something about travelling and movement, and just allowing that rhythm to take over, allows you to access your unconscious mind. And James has put it lovely there. Is it because people are generally in trance when mooching about? We're generally in trance most of the time. And it's only the rare times that we're consciously aware that what's going on. So one of the things that Martin's saying, does it generate a particular type of brainwave? Yes, initially people start to move into this alpha brainwave. And alpha is the creative state, coming up with new ideas, especially walking in nature. Now it can happen in town centres, but you'll notice, and this is an interesting phenomenon to notice, and is that every town has its own tempo. So for example, London is actually quite a fast tempo, and people there who live there move at this tempo, and anybody who's visiting stands out because they normally walk in slowly. Yet if you visit Austin, Texas, that has a much slower tempo as a town, so you have to slow down. Whereas if you visit Brighton, it's only ever so slightly slower than London. And so if London is about 90 beats per minute, we'll find Brighton around about 70-75 beats per minute. And everywhere you go, you can pick up the rhythm. And if you want to be a native, walk in time with that rhythm. So, yeah, walking in the countryside, it's easier to lose yourself, as there's not so many people to bump into. And this is one of the great things about modelling human excellence, especially geniuses like Mozart. And here, notice we're doing it from a letter rather than a real person, because I wasn't around when Mozart was about. Is that it informs us about success that's bigger than the thing the person was doing. Alright, we've got some more input coming. So Martin, should we try to generate a specific brainwave when we're modelling? Right, Martin, I'm just going to get you clarified. Are you talking that about yourself or with the person you're modelling? Now, one of the things you do for yourself, you do want to go the subject. Right. So how would we create a particular brainwaves? Well, we won't know what that is, but what we want to do is what I call put them in the kitchen. Which essentially means whatever it is that you're modeling. So if you're modeling shopping, you get them, you go shopping with them. And this is one of the things we talked about right at the beginning, this intuitive ability to be able to model human excellence. Now, strategies comes after the intuitive phase. So if you wanted to model successful coaches, for example, you'd want to see them in action over a period of time. If you wanted to model painters or photographers and find out what their strategies were, you'd want to spend as much time as you possibly can with them. Public speakers, you want to see them as often as you can, watch their videos over and over again, and what that does, it picks up the unconscious patterns that are going on. The intuitive ability, you're not saying that you have to be able to do it, I'm talking about this intuitive ability of paying attention to the person over and over again before you start to ask them questions, really makes sense when you do it, because suddenly your questions are much more precise, and you won't really know why, but that's because your unconscious mind has a pattern that it's formed, and it's now wanting to fill in some of that detail, and hence the conscious modelling. So I'm a big believer in both. But it's not our job to put the subject into a certain frame of mind. We want to find out how they do it. And of course we can do that from many different places, as Charlotte's saying. From TVs. TVs, as we know, I'm sure we've touched upon, is the mirror neurons in the brain, and when we're engrossed in those stories, we are acting out. And this is why if you're in a film that makes and there's something that makes you jump, the whole audience jumps into the air. And that's because we're all there in the moment. Our brains are learning machines. Which also does imply, be careful what films you watch. Great. As we're moving into the last 3 or so minutes of this session, I think we've got time for one more question. Okay, so I'm just waiting for this last question to come through now. So, a couple of things that I think is important as we're waiting for this question to come through, just to highlight the difference between micro, macro, and meta strategies. If you take that away from this session, that's important for the goal setting part. So Charlotte said, so by working out someone's strategy, you can help them change their behavior if that's what they want. That's a lovely way of using it. You can use it as a diagnostic tool to find out what's happening in somebody's head at a particular point within the strategies and make changes when you need to. So that's a great insight, Charlotte, and it's a fabulous way of using strategies. Wow. What I invite you to do is to start to get the use of eliciting strategies. They don't have to be large strategies, and we're not always talking about macro strategies. Is once a day, just take 15 minutes and start to elicit a strategy. Start to pay attention to what can you pick up from the information the person has given you. 10 to 15 minutes a day for 10 days will accelerate your skill in this ability. Definitely for modeling and for your own skill of being able to pick up these strategies. Thank you ever so much, guys. Alright, so within this, do you have to ask the person? You can do indirect modeling, but it will make it easier if the person knows, especially while you're learning. It gives you permission to think about your questions. And do check your practitioner manuals also for questions that you can ask. And for you guys doing the master practitioner, you have even more information there. Thanks ever so much, guys. Really appreciate your input. It does make a difference. Have a great evening and talk soon. All the best now. Thank you. Hi, Rob. Long time no see. James. See you next week. Looking forward to it. Elvis has left the building. Thank you and good night.